All right, thanks. All right, let's start the next CPEP seminar. Thank you, Stefan. Getting everyone's attention. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Valerie Trouet. Before I introduce her, I just want to announce a couple of our new traditions in our CPEP seminar series since we've been this year. One is that we do invite all of you afterwards, if you have, especially if you want to pepper the speaker with some good questions over a pint of beer over at Union South at the set. I believe we'll be setting up on the second floor inside today because of the weather. So come on over, there's cheese, and I will buy the first 2 pitchers of beer. So come and join me. We'll be there until 5:30 or so. Immediately after the talk. Other tradition is I do want to make sure that we try to get and hear from all voices in this room, and so I do encourage and try to get questions first from students or early career scientists. Of course, if no one wants to speak up and our glaring is not working at you, then we'll open up the floor as well to everyone. But just something to think about for those of you at the end of the talk. Come up with a good question. You'll value another year. Today we're going to hear about tree rings and climate dynamics. And this is a really cool topic. It's one that Professor Trouet has pioneered, and she's done that through her work at the University of Arizona. Prior to that, she was in Belgium, where she got her bachelor's, master's, and PhD at KU Leuven in Belgium in bioscience engineering. Sounds like an interesting title, but you want to learn more about that. And then after that, she came to the US and was a postdoc at Penn State University in geography, and then eventually joined the University of Arizona lab in tree ring research after a stint also in the Swiss Federal Research Institute. Some other things you should know about her. She is a highly prolific scientist. Some of her papers that have really documented tree rings and their effect and how you can diagnose and understand climate from them. For example, her 2009 paper in Science has been cited 800 times on how to understand NAO in the medieval climate anomaly, which is kind of cool. She has a forthcoming popular press book coming out from Johns Hopkins Press called Tree Story, which is about the story of tree rings. So add that to your family's Christmas in July present list, when is it coming out?
April.
April, okay, so your Passover fair shopping list, whatever. Your choice. And then the other thing, if you want to poke your brain, as I like to, is that Dr. Trouet is also an editor of Geophysical Research Letters, certainly a journal I think a lot of us in the room like to read and publish in, and so also feel free to ask your questions about that. Today we're going to hear a little bit about this topic I mentioned, a paleoclimate perspective on large-scale climate dynamics. With that, I'll let it over to you. Thanks.
Thank you, Encore. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's been a great honor, and thank you all for coming. So, as Encore mentioned, I am a tree ring scientist. I use tree rings to study the climate of the past and how it relates to what we know about human history and environmental history. So in that sense, I think my research fits the climate, people, and environment topic quite well. If you want to hear more about what we do in our lab, please visit our website. But it boils down to this. Using tree rings, we use tree rings to study climatic change and specifically natural climate variability. We also study how it impacts human societies, how it impacts ecosystems, and then how it impacts the carbon cycle and forest ecosystems and disturbances to these ecosystems. So for those of you who are not familiar with tree rings, these are tree rings. We don't just count them, we actually measure their width and their density. And so how much a tree grows in a year is a function of the climate under which the tree grows. And so by measuring the width of tree rings, we can look at these past climatic conditions. And there's obviously many ways of looking at the climate of the past. And some of the advantages of tree rings is that the disadvantage is that we're limited in time. So the longest continuous tree ring chronology is 12,000 years, so that's about the Holocene. Most tree ring data cover no more than the last 2,000 years. So we can really, in terms of climate reconstruction, it's hard to go back further in time than that. But those are very important years, those past 2,000 years, because they're also the period over which we know most about human history. It's the best documented period in time. And we're also, with tree ring, we look at timescales from decades to centuries, typically. And these are also, in climate perspectives, the kind of timescales that are relevant for policy makers. So we're really able to look at climate on timescales that are relevant for policy. I mentioned that the longest continuous tree ring chronology is about 12,000 years. For that, to achieve that kind of length, we don't just make use of living trees, but we can match the patterns that we see in living trees with those that we see in dead trees, and also in any wood, really. So whether that is from historical buildings, from archaeological material, or even subfossil wood, we can connect the patterns that we see in the wood of these sources, and hence extend our tree ring chronology back in time. As Encore mentioned, if you want to learn more about this, or if you want to teach your family about tree rings, I spend my sabbatical and at Sabbatical Plus, writing a broad audience book about tree rings and what we know from them about human history and climate history. It will come out in April, and it's published by Johns Hopkins University Press. So if you're interested, keep an eye out. One of the things I talk about in the book is the history of tree ring chronology, tree ring research. So we started as a community about a century ago in the 1930s. And so over the last 90 years, we've been developing a network of tree ring chronologies that, this is, as you can tell, is focused primarily in North America and Europe. And broadly speaking, really is much more extensive in the Northern Hemisphere than in the Southern Hemisphere, legally flown in the tropics. But a lot of the research that I do makes use of that existing network. So rather than going out to every single spot myself and coring trees, I make use of this existing network. And the advantage is that it allows us, from a climatic perspective, not just to look at the climate in one point in space, let's say not just to look at maybe here at Chile or for instance, Atlas Mountains in Morocco, but to see how the climate in the past of this location is linked to that in other locations, to really look at climate dynamics and climate dynamical patterns rather than the climate of one point in space. And that's what I'll be talking about today. So in the realm of the schedule that I showed earlier, it's this aspect that I'll be talking about, and it's really the main focus of my research. And the reason why I'm so interested in climate dynamics and what we can what tree rings can tell us about it is that when I started in a tree ring lab, I really wanted to figure out how to use tree rings to address some of the most pressing climate change issues. Not just looking at purely theoretically what was happening in the past, but how that information about the past can inform us about what's happening in the future. And so today I'll talk about 3 studies that we did. The first one is related to the expansion of the tropics. And then 2 studies of past jet stream variability, one for the North Atlantic jet region, and then one for the Eastern North Pacific region. In terms of the expansion of the tropics, I'm talking about the tropics, the atmospheric tropics, not the vegetation underneath it. And so to simplify things, when we talk about the tropics, atmospherically speaking, talking about a region of the heavy circulation. So heavy circulation consists of warm air rising at the equator. It then dissipates poleward in both directions to level out the energy budget. The warm air moves poleward. And as it moves poleward, it cools down because it moves and it's moving forward. And as it cools down, at some point, so as it cools down, it also rains out. That's why the vegetation in the tropical region is rainforest. At some point, around 30 degrees north and south, that air has cooled down so much that it sinks. So it no longer lifts, but it sinks. And so those latitudes, the horse latitudes, around 30 degrees north and south, I'm simplifying things a lot here, which is something that we paleoclimatologists tend to do. Those latitudes where the air sinks, it pushes away, it creates a high pressure field and it pushes away storm tracks and rain patterns. So those latitudes, that's how I define the extent of the tropics in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. That's where a lot of the deserts are located. For instance, the Sonoran Desert where I live in Tucson is at 32 degrees. So knowing all that, if you look, so here on this graph is based on satellite imagery from the 1980 to the present, the actual latitude of that extent of the tropics in the Northern Hemisphere and the Southern Hemisphere. You see that the tropics have been expanding in both hemispheres for the last 30 years. There's a number of reasons or a hypothesis of why this is the case. In the Southern Hemisphere, the hole in the ozone layer has something to do with it. Obviously, anthropogenic climate change plays a role, black soup plays a role. But if you put all of those factors into a climate model, you do see that indeed, depending on the model a little bit, but you do see an increase, so an expansion of the tropics also in the climate models, but when you compare it to the actual expansion that we're seeing in reality, it's much less extreme than what the observations are telling us. So this is the expansion of the observations versus various models. So this is because this influences where the dry regions are at and whether those dry regions are going to expand. This is important towards the future as well. The reason why there's one of the reasons why there's a discrepancy between observations and observations and models is that we're working with very short time series, relatively speaking. So this is observations are based on the satellite era from 1980 to the present. So our question was whether we could use tree rings to expand that observational period of the position, the extent of the latitudinal extent of the tropics, to expand that further back in time. To make sure that we're all on the same page, so our target for reconstruction, what we are reconstructing, is the latitude of this. So it's the latitude at which the tropical warm air sinks. We're averaging this latitude over the entire Northern Hemisphere and for the spring, February, March, April. So we have one target, spring, Northern Hemisphere, Hadley cell extent. We calculated our target based on 20th century, too many things, 20th century reanalysis data. So time series of 84 years as a target. When you use that index and when you look at what the climate is like in the Northern Hemisphere in years when that tropical extent is further north versus when it's further south, these are PDSI, so hydroclimate patterns. You see there are certain regions, especially between 35 and 45 degrees north, where when the tropics contract, when the Hadley cell is further south, it becomes wetter than average. There's other regions where it actually becomes drier than average. For instance, here in the Arkansas and the central southeast of the U.S. And vice versa. When it moves north, when the tropics expand, southwest gets drier, Turkey gets drier, Tibetan Plateau gets drier, and so forth. So our idea was now to use tree rings from 5 of these regions, using that network of tree rings that I showed earlier, to select tree rings, one from regions that are sensitive, where the hydroclimate is sensitive to the position of the Hadley cell, and then looking in those regions, aiming to find tree rings that are sensitive to the hydroclimate, and then testing whether those tree rings themselves actually reflect that variability, intraannual variability in Hadley cell extent. So we selected these 5 regions, different tree species, but if you combine them all, so hydroclimate sensitive tree species in regions where their hydroclimate is sensitive to the position of the Hadley cell. You combine them, those 5 tree ring series, so all 5 of them go back to 1532, and then 3 of the 5 regions go back to 1200, so 800 years of Hadley cell variability. You combine them in a model and compare them in red now, so you're going to see a lot of wiggly lines in this graph, because it's kind of what we do. Red is the target, is the Hadley cell extent that I was talking about. So years when the Hadley cell moves further north than average, and then years when it moves further south than average. And the gray and the black lines are our models based on the tree ring data. You see it matches quite well, and so the model based on all 5 regions explains 51% of the variance in Hadley cell extent. The longer record that goes back to 1200 explains 45%. So those are still skillful reconstructions. So all of this work was done by my postdoc Raquel Sanchez, or led by my postdoc at the time, Raquel, who did not have a paleoclimate background at all. She came in from a wildfire and forestry angle, came to do a postdoc with me, and I actually remember when I asked her, like, I think we can do a Hadley cell reconstruction, what do you think? And her question was, what's the Hadley cell? I'm like, okay, I think I got my work cut out for me. But so she did phenomenal. She learned so much in such a short period of time. So she did all of this work, developed the reconstruction, not coming from a paleoclimate background. She then went, okay, Valerie, here is your reconstruction. What do we do now? This is the first time I saw the reconstruction. And I was like, Raquel, what is this here? I am going to take a pointer here. This is here in the early 1800s, like the most negative year of your reconstruction. And she looked it up, and she's 1816, and I'm like, bingo. And she's like, what do you mean, bingo? So for paleoclimatologists, 1816 is a well-known year because it's the year without summer. It's the year following the Mount Tambora volcanic eruption in Indonesia, one of the biggest volcanic eruptions. And so we know from temperature reconstructions that 1816 was a very cold year, pretty much globally, as far as we have global temperature records. So this led us to analyze whether, we have 800 years of Hadley cell extent now. There's about 30 big volcanic eruptions that we know of in those 800 years. So if you combine, if you don't just look at that one year, 1850, 1860, if you do a superposed epoch analysis using those 30 volcanic eruptions, so superposed epoch analysis is pretty much similar to a composite analysis. This is, you look at what the Hadley cell position is in the year 0, which is a volcanic eruption, and then the 5 years following the volcanic eruption, and the 5 years prior to the volcanic eruption. And so the circles here mean statistical significance, and you see a contraction of the tropics following volcanic eruptions. And as you go to, so this is 1 Pinatubo in red and 2 Pinatubo in blue, meaning those volcanic eruptions that are as big as Pinatubo in 91, 92, or twice as big as that. You see the contraction becomes stronger as the volcanic eruptions become stronger. So this is a big deal because the climate models show indeed that the tropics contract following volcanic eruptions. But we haven't been able to show that using observational data because there's not enough big volcanic eruptions over the 20th century. So now we have 800 years of Hadley cell. We can actually show observationally that the tropics contract following volcanic eruptions, which per se is important because mimicking volcanic eruptions is one of the climate engineering solutions that is being studied. So by lack of diminishing carbon dioxide emissions, scientists and engineers are thinking of spewing sulfur into the stratosphere to mimic that cooling effect of volcanic eruptions. Now this kind of research shows that by doing that, you wouldn't just cool the Earth's atmosphere, you would also really change the hydroclimatic patterns throughout various countries. So it could be a very, very tricky and risky thing to do. The other thing that came out of this study, so this is the same reconstruction that I showed earlier of the Hadley cell extent from 1200 to the present, now smoothed, so looking at decadal timescales. And there's one period that stands out in the late 16th, early 1700s, so from 1570 to 1635, which was a prolonged period of expansion period. So where the Northern Hemisphere tropics were further north than average. And if you remember that hydroclimatic map I showed earlier, what happens when the Hadley cell is further north than average, this results in drought in the southwestern U.S., on the eastern seaboard, in Turkey, in China, and so forth. And so if you put one and one together, and you look at that same period of expansion, you see that there's simultaneous societal disruption that happened during those 65 years. So most of you in American history, the failure of Roanoke and of the Jamestown colonies, that was then. That was in the late 1500s, early 1600s. And we know from independent treating data that drought played an important role in that. So drought on the eastern seaboard resulted in failure of the early English colonies. At the same time, in Turkey, the early Ottoman Empire had dealt with the Salali rebellion, so the peasant rebellion by lack of food because of a drought. Same idea, the severe societal disruption of one of the biggest empires at the time, the Ottoman Empire, happened at the same time. At the same time, if we move further east, the Ming Dynasty came to an end in that same period. Again, severe drought led to rebellion from peasants and the broader population, which eventually led to the end of the Ming Dynasty. So because the extent of the tropics or of the Hadley cell creates these hydroclimatic patterns not just in one area but throughout the Northern Hemisphere, you see these societal disruptions that all happen at the same time. So history warns us for the potential, if something similar were to happen in the future, it wouldn't just have climatic impacts, but it might also impact our socioeconomic system. And I'm trying to be careful not to be an environmental determinist here. I'm not saying that climate is the sole and only driver of socioeconomic change in history, but if you look at history, if you look at the climate of the past, there are links. And there are a lot of factors that modulate that relationship, but there's no denying the links between it. So the second topic I want to talk about is variability in the jet stream. I know there's people in the room who are very familiar with this topic from a climatological perspective. And this is again one of those issues, climate change issues, that are a topic of debate where I think we as paleoclimatologists can contribute to the debate, but we're not doing it yet. And so part of this debate is that in recent years, so for those, the jet stream are the winds at high above the Earth's surface, the tropopause, where airplanes fly. And those winds circle the Earth's surface in a eastward direction because of the Coriolis force. You find them in the Northern Hemisphere, you find them in the Southern Hemisphere. Again, because of treating network being especially extensive in the Northern Hemisphere, we focus our research in the Northern Hemisphere. But so, a simplified version is that the jet stream circles the hemisphere in a fairly straightforward path. What is happening in recent years is that path is becoming more meandering. So you get bigger waves of the jet stream path. And as that happens, because of the bigger waves, you can think of it as a river, it slows down. So if a river goes straight down a mountain on a steep slope, it's going to go fast. A meandering river that goes in the delta slows down a lot. The question is whether this or not this is related to faster warming of the Arctic compared to the tropical regions under anthropogenic climate change, but that's not a question that we can address using treatments. But for the purpose of what I'm trying to explain here, is you can think of the jet stream as the border between cool air in the Arctic region and warmer air in the tropics. And so as you get big waves in the jet stream, when the jet comes further south, that cool Arctic air comes further south as well, and you get the Snowmageddon and the Niagara Falls freezing over and the whole the polar vortex as it's being coined in the media. On the other hand, if the jet stream is further north than normal, you get the warm tropical air moving further north than normal, and so you get warmer than average temperatures. So one region where this is expressed quite explicitly, and this is how I came up with the idea to do this. So as Anker said, I'm from Belgium originally, which is located here. Belgium's weather and climate is very much influenced by the position of the jet stream over Europe. So in a normal year, and I'm talking about summer now, in a normal year the jet moves kind of north of the British Isles, and so you get fairly nice, it's relative speaking, you get fairly nice summer weather in Belgium. In a year when the jet is further south than normal, you get much cooler air coming down to Belgium, and so the jet stream moves right over Belgium, and the area underneath the jet stream is a moisture band. So this was, the summer of 2012, I went home to visit my parents, and it was horrible there. It was horrible. And this is when the jet was in this prolonged position there, and that's where I figured, I think we can do something about this using tree rings. The opposite happens, for instance, happened in the summer of 2006. We have a very big heat wave over Western Europe. that if you look at the Balkans, for instance, you see actually cooler than average condition. So this is, I want to go back to this map. So this is, the weather was so bad, this is not from 2012, but I saw a similar map in 2012 in a newspaper actually when I was at my parents' house. And I realized like this dipole of warm conditions in the Balkans, in southeastern Europe, versus cooler than average conditions where I was at in Belgium. And that map struck me because this is a map I just made a few months earlier using tree ring data from that we had collected in the Balkans. And this is I'm not explaining it well, but let's take a step back. If you look at the position of the jet, the North Atlantic jet, so the latitudinal position, and you compare it to temperatures over Europe, this is what you get. You see that dipole. So you get positive correlations with temperatures over the British Isles and negative correlations with temperatures over the Balkans. And so similar idea as with the Hadley said earlier, if we can find temperature-sensitive reconstructions, tree ring data, tree-based reconstructions from those two regions, and they counter-correlate with each other, can we reconstruct that position of the jet? Can we use these tree rings collected at the Earth's surface to reconstruct climatic patterns that happen 10 kilometers above the Earth's surface? And I want to take a step back here because this is really what we are doing here to get, so this is a close-up of a tree ring. To get a temperature signal out of your tree rings, we often don't measure the width of the tree ring, but the density of the wood. So how the density of the wood varies from year to year. The density of the wood is based on the thickness of the cell wall. So these are all individual wood cells. This is the early wood formed in spring. This is the late wood formed in late summer. So the density of the wood, what we do is we actually measure the cell wall thickness of these individual wood cells. And what we do in the study is we link thickness of a wood cell is like the tenth of a millimeter. The cell wall is even smaller than that. We link that to this. The patterns of the jet stream happening 10 kilometers above the Earth's surface. And it works. This is science. It works. So to do that, we were lucky. I worked in the Balkans, in Greece, and Bulgaria, and Albania. Very beautiful trees, Bosnian pine, on the right. I haven't worked in Scotland or the British Isles. My colleagues I collaborated with, you see Rob Wilson and Milos Schmidveld here. They're less lucky. You don't find old trees like that in the British Isles because the Romans got rid of all old trees. So they have to dive into the lochs in Scottish weather and actually schlep trees or subfossil wood of trees that have fallen into these lakes, schlep that out of the lakes, cut pieces, cookies of those logs out of there and cross it and hope that they find enough trees that actually span the time period that we're interested in. So my colleagues in Scotland are still working on that part, but for now we have a 300-year-long tree ring chronology from the Balkans and then a 300 years from Scotland. Measure density in both of them. Density is temperature, summer temperature sensitive in both regions, and so if you compare the two, Brit stands for British Isles, Nemet stands for Northeastern Mediterranean, so that's the Balkans chronology, and the Balkans one is now in first. So you can see that the two are actually, over the full 300 years, inversely correlated with each other. The only reason why temperature in the Balkans is inversely correlated with temperature in the British Isles is because of the North Atlantic Chapter. That's the driver of the temperature dipole that I was talking about earlier. What's interesting, and I've pointed some years out here, exceptions to that anti-correlation are, for instance, 1816, when it was just cold everywhere. After volcanic eruptions, we don't get the dipole. The volcanic signal is stronger than what the North Atlantic jet is. And so if you combine the two, the British Isles temperature reconstruction and the Mediterranean reconstruction, and you compare it to the target, to the latitudinal position of the North Atlantic jet, more weakly aligned, so now over the 20th century, in red is the target, so the position of the North Atlantic jet, latitudinal position. In blue is our model based on the tree rings from the Balkans and from the British Isles. See that the tree ring data explain about 40% of the variance in the target. Unfortunately for now, a lot of the data that were collected in the Balkans and in the British Isles were collected in 1978, so in the late 70s. That means that the tree ring data don't go further back into the present than that. The last ring is the last data point. So we've also been updating, not just trying to bring this chronology further back in time, but also updating it to the present. This is done that reconstruction, so about 290 years. In red is the target, in blue, so instrumental data, blue is our reconstruction. If you look at the average position of the jet over those 300 years, you don't see really dramatic change. Not really any trends in either direction. The top is again that same reconstruction. If you're now on the bottom, look at how many, per 30-year period, how many positions are anomalous, are more than one standard deviation removed from that average position. You see a steep increase in recent years of the number of anomalies. More extreme jet stream positions since about the 1960s. That's another way of looking at it. At the very bottom is again our reconstruction, now looking at the coefficient of variance over time. So you see that there's ups and downs, but since the 1960s there's an unprecedented increase in the variance. So again, the number of the extremes around the mean of the jet stream. To look at other reconstructions of the El Nino pattern and of the California current, and even at this point when we published this, there was not yet a reconstruction of the jet stream for the North Pacific, but those are storm track reconstructions, and so you can see a similar increase in the California current, in storm tracks over the North Pacific, all happening at the same time. I'm sorry, I should point out this is all increases in variance, not increase in the actual value. So you see variance increases, more extreme values in all of this. And then at the top is a quasi-resonance of jet stream based on, at the top is observational data, at the bottom is a kind of model. This is from Michael Mann's work. You can see that also there's been an increase. A quasi-resonance is a way of looking at the waviness of the jet stream to simplify. So you see also an increase in waviness of the jet in sync with what we're finding with our reconstruction. So post-1960s, we see an increase in North Atlantic jet anomalies, which co-occurs with variance also over the North Pacific using various patterns, and a wavier, slower jet stream. So we're not able to explain what's happening with the jet stream at the moment. We are able to put it in a longer term context. So we've been very lucky. You're going to see trees in this presentation. We've been very lucky because we found the oldest living tree in the Balkans in Greece, the oldest living tree in Europe. We named it Adonis, after the god of beauty. And it's 1,075 years old. And so the site where we found it looks like this, gorgeous, high up in the mountains in Greece. What you can see, why I'm showing this picture is you don't only see old trees, but this dead wood that's been lying on the landscape for a very long time. And so as I mentioned earlier, we can bring this reconstruction further back in time by linking our living tree chronologies to the dead tree material. And so preliminary data or density chronology for Greece and our temperature reconstruction now actually goes back to 600. The temperature reconstruction of my colleagues in Scotland goes back 800 years to 1200. And this is in the middle of the blue is the North Atlantic jet reconstruction that I showed earlier. So we'll be able to add on at least another 500 years to our reconstruction once we've finalized this analysis. So that's work in progress, and hopefully you'll see more about that soon. So the third study I want to talk about is led by my colleague Jean Weil at NOAA. He's a climate modeler. And using the same idea, but using a data assimilation between paleoclimate data, treeing data, and climate model, we've now reconstructed the jet stream over the North Pacific region. And so the results I'm going to show, and I'm not going to go into too much detail about how we did that, but I can tell you more if you're interested. The results I'm going to show are for this longitudinal section. So the same thing, we're looking at the latitudinal position and the strength of the jet stream at this longitude. And when you look, I'm going to be showing quite a lot of these figures. So this is now degrees north from the equator to the pole. This is the speed, the wind speed at 200 millibars, so the speed of the jet stream during wet years in California in blue and dry years in California in red. So this is for the instrumental period. You can see that when the jet stream is located right over California and is strong, that's when you get high precipitation over California. The winds and storm tracks bring precipitation to California, so your wet years in California are related to a fast and focused jet stream. Very different pattern in dry years when the jet is not as focused on California and typically is also weaker. So this is using instrumental data. We make the same graph, now using our reconstruction on the right versus the instrumental error on the left, see a very similar pattern. Over the last, since 1570, wet years occur when the jet is fast and focused over California. Dry years are much less intense jet and less focused jet. So that's great, that's interesting. What we did then is link this to fire history in California. So one thing I haven't yet talked about is that we can also use tree rings to look at past wildfires. And so this is what I did when I was a postdoc at Penn State, is I collected a network of 30 sites, I should say 29 sites, throughout the Sierra Nevada and California, about 2,000 samples with about 20,000 fire scars all in all. And so how does this work? How do fires leave scars in trees? Give me 1 second. So the fire history of California is a little different than what it is now. There used to be frequent, low-intensity ground fires. This kind of fire that would not reach the canopy and does not kill trees, but it would kill off the understory of the forest and thus kill off the fuel. These kind of ground fires they don't kill the trees, but they can harm the trees, they can wound the trees, they can leave scars in the trees. This is what that kind of fire scar look like. This stump there has two, they're called cat faces, so they're really a sequence of fire scars, because the tree gets wounded by fire, doesn't get killed, so then there's a few fire-free years, and trees can't, they can't heal wounds. The only thing they can do is try and grow over them. So a tree tries and grow over the wound caused by the fire, but then another fire hits, and so you get another wound. And so these are sequences. Each of these layers is the tree trying to grow over a previous fire scar. And so I've seen trees with 30, 35 fire scars in them. If you sample a tree, these are the fire scars. You really see them very clearly, all of them. And by using tree ring dating, so by using the widths of the tree rings, you can actually date the exact year of when each of these fires happened. In some cases it's so clear, like here, so clear, by looking at the scar within the tree ring, you can actually tell the seasonality of the fire, whether it happened in the early wood, in the late wood, or in the dormant season. So as I mentioned here, very frequent fires in California in the past, up until 1900, and then nothing. So this is a sample taken from a live tree in 1994. So you used to get wildfires in California every 5 to 10 years. After 1900 century or no, because we've been very successful at putting them out. So we really created a wildfire deficit. We really messed up the regular natural fire regime, and that's where we're getting into the conditions, one of the reasons why we're getting into the wildfire conditions that we're seeing. But that's not what I want to talk about here. So these fire scars, if you tally them all up for California, for the Sierra Nevada, so we have a record back to 1500, up until 1900. We can't go into the present because there's just no fire scars in the 20th century. But so this tells you the story of which ones were the big fire years in California. What we can then do is compare this record, the big fire years from this record, to the jet stream reconstruction that we developed earlier. And this is now that comparison. On the left is the dry and wet years, what the jet stream does during dry and wet years. On the right is what the jet stream does during high fire and low fire years over the since 1571 up to the beginning of the 20th century. And so you see very similar patterns. It all makes sense, right? The jet stream is strong and focused on California. It's wet and you don't get many fires. It's kind of similar to if you take that fire history record that I showed and you just correlate it against an independent drought reconstruction for California, this is what you get. So there's fires in California are driven by drought. It's not much more complicated than that. At least historically speaking, what we see for the 20th century, if you do the same exercise for the 20th century, this is now divvied up between before 77 and after 77, but really it doesn't really matter. You can just look at the two top records. These are now the precipitation extremes over the 20th century, so you see the same idea. When the jet stream is strong and focused on California, you get the wettest years. But when you look at the fires in the 20th century, that connection between the two is lost. So these fires are now based on, again, we don't have fire scars for the 20th century, but there's annual area burn data, so records of actually how much fire burned. If you tally it up for California, you see that there's no longer a connection, and especially after 78, there's no longer a connection between what the jet stream does and what fires do, which is problematic because it means that, it used to be that you got a wet winter in California because of the jet, you would be pretty safe in terms of the following fire season. That's no longer the case. it can be wet or it can be dry in winter. Either way, the risk is there that you're going to get a big fire season. And we've seen it in 27 and 28. So there's been an uncoupling in the 20th century between California fire extremes and the behavior of the North Pacific jet. Reasons for that is, as what I was explaining, the century of fire suppression was really uncoupled the climate-fire interaction. So I think that's most of what I wanted to tell you today. I want to thank many people in my group and some of my collaborators for all the work. This is obviously not a one-person work. I want to thank you for your attention.
Open up for questions, preferably from the student or early career scientist first. Good.
So I had a question when you mentioned being in Belgium in the summer of 2012 and how miserable it was, and that seemed like it correlated with your jet stream study. So I'm wondering if you thought about, because 2012 was also a huge extensive melt over Greenland, and you looked at correlating your tree ring with ice cores to look at if anything with the jet position has to do with possibly melting in Greenland.
So there's two, well, I'm not going to go back. There's two aspects that I want to talk about here. One, I have thought about it, because really the position of the North Atlantic jet in summer is really the summer NAO. I mean, it's the same. The jet is at 300 millibar, but the NAO is the expression of what happens at the Earth's surface. So they're super closely linked. Then the summer NAO has a big impact on what's happening in Greenland. Vice versa, and Steve and I were discussing this morning, in terms of what the jet stream is doing or not doing in response to the melt in Greenland and throughout the Arctic. What's happening now is happening so fast that there's really no equivalent over the last 300 years. So there is some sea ice reconstruction for the Arctic, but it looks like this. So it's not because our jet stream reconstruction doesn't show a year-to-year relation to sea ice over the last 300 years that it doesn't mean that there's no relation to that.
Well, I was talking about the ice sheet, but yeah, I see where you're not sea ice, but
I see. Yeah.
But I was thinking even if you
yeah.
were able to go, because you can go far enough back in the tree ring that you could go prior to kind of the more recent changes we've seen.
I see. Yeah. Still, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see if we see something with the once we have the 1,000 year long.
Yeah, and I'm mixed on the agreement about NAO over Greenland. That's like a hot topic for debate. I don't always agree with it, because they like to say when you have negative NAO, you have this high pressure over Greenland, but I don't always think that's equivalent to melting. So.
That's fair. I study
No, we
trees
can
on
talk
ice,
more.
so
It'd be
I don't-
interesting to look at that.
Yeah. So yeah, the high pressure is there over Greenland.
Yeah.
So that results in that.
Yeah.
Question? Open the floor. Go ahead, Steve.
There's been talk about weather whiplash in different parts of the world, but especially California, I've heard it applied, where you have a winter that's really wet and then immediately really dry. Do you see evidence of those sorts of things happening in the past, or
Yeah,
more
so,
or less
well, a
frequently
little
present?
bit, but that's really what we're getting at. So I know my grad student, hold on, let me, so I first want to show you Diana, so Maura Reyes. She's studying exactly that. So looking at stream flow reconstructions and precip reconstructions over California to see whether that whiplash effect has occurred in the past. And it's really linked to, I'm sorry, this is annoying, but so this is in the blue oak trees in California, and this is the California current index. They're not jet stream, but they're related to it. And you see this, it's not unprecedented, but the fact that they're all happening at the same time is unprecedented. So you have to be a little bit careful when you, careful. You can't just, there's things we can reconstruct using tree rings and there's things that we cannot reconstruct using tree rings, depending on the season, depending on the time scale on which these things happen. But from the indications that we do have, there does appear to be an increased variance and hence whiplash on recent years. Questions?
Your proxy for the the Hadley cell expansion is pinned to the northern position, right? So do you know that it's expansion based on just your observations versus translation of the whole system?
That's a really good question. So I have colleagues who are working on the Southern Hemisphere. It's harder there again because there's less land and less tree rings. So it's less. It's hard. It's actually my colleague who presented this for the Southern Hemisphere who gave us the idea to do it, to try it for the Northern Hemisphere, and it's easier for the Northern Hemisphere as it turns out. So I don't know. We'll have to wait to see what comes out of the Southern Hemisphere, but that would be more like the ITCZ movies, right? So I don't think that's what it is that we're seeing, but I can't give you a definite answer.
Are there records far enough back that you could do a similar reconstruction for the pre-boreal oscillation in the early Holocene? Do you have enough tree records at the pre-boreal oscillation in the early Holocene, so like 10,000 years ago, to do a similar type of?
No, there's two.
Okay.
And neither of them is very climate sensitive. So
Yeah.
there's a German-Irish oak chronology.
Yes, right.
And then there's the Brazilian pine chronology for white lines in California. That's the only records that go back that far. And again, they're not we don't have a climate reconstruction based on the tree ring chronology. Germany the climate's too nice and trees are not very sensitive.
And I noticed that your tropical HCE, like the maps, like the Southern Hemisphere correlations seem really extensive and large in terms of
Yeah, it's
geometry.
strange,
And those
isn't
are
it?
really
Yeah,
curious.
yeah.
Like, I don't know if any of you thought a lot about why.
It's more the tropical region. Right?
Yeah, okay.
I noticed that. Unfortunately, I'm going to still practice.
Yeah.
I'm moving in the wrong direction anyway. But yeah, I noticed that as well. Unfortunately, again, we don't really have tree ring chronologies there to do anything with it.
Yeah.
You were talking about
Yeah,
this.
yeah.
Yeah, this sort of
Yep.
hemisphere actually. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So that maybe gives an indication that maybe it is a whole movement rather than expansion.
You have time for one more question?
I was also in the tree rings that when the tree is young, those rings are really wide.
Yeah.
And as you age, they get narrower and narrower. And I'm just wondering,
Oh, you deal with that?
you know,
Yeah. So that is one of the. Yeah. So it's purely a function of geometry, right? A tree if it wants to put on the same amount of biomass, if its diameter is bigger, it's going to result in a thinner layer. So mostly we do detrend when doing climate reconstruction. So you get rid of that H trend. So you can model the H trend, the size trend really, as we call it. Especially if you have enough. So we never base our reconstructions on one or two samples. We do a big collection of samples. So you can estimate that trend that is due to, that has nothing to do with climate, but that's due to the size of the tree. But that's a very tricky thing to do, because how do you know that you're getting rid of the size trend and only the size trend and not low frequency climate variation? So we do the best we can, but that is definitely a topic of where we're trying as a community, aiming hard to do the best job that we can, and we're still working on finding the best way of doing it.
I was wondering if you have any idea what the relative role of temperature versus water supply and availability. I mean, for a really young tree, I would imagine that its water loss is not really nearly what it is when it was a lot larger.
Yeah, so the trend has very little to do, there's a little bit of a juvenile effect, just that younger trees want to, like humans, younger people grow faster. But most of it is purely geometrical, it has nothing to do with climate. It is purely because, if you have a tree that's this size and it wants to put on biomass, it's going to grow a wide ring. If the tree is this size, if it wants to put on the same amount of biomass, it's going to result in a very small, narrow ring because it's got to cover more volume, right? So the volume is the same, but it results in a much narrower ring. So it's got very little to do with, it's purely tree architecture.
Let's thank our speaker. If you have time, there should be lots of cheese and crackers sponsored by the CCUP program. And next week we'll have another seminar. It will be a new faculty member here at UW-Madison in biological engineering. Zhu Zhang will be giving a talk about artificial intelligence for sustainable agriculture. So please do come next Tuesday at 3:30. Great, thanks.